Lineage Series, Book 1, Chapter 3. Only 40 yards from the huts, Milan spotted the first Sadie. Their covered lanterns enabled them to dazzle any trespassers with a sudden beam of light out of the supposed dark. Two parties, in parallel patrols, moved ahead of her in the very direction she needed to go, and their combined light, if turned toward her, would be enough to betray a dark figure among the trees. Milan suspected she would find a similar strategy throughout the whole forest. Parallel patrols, like the teeth of a comb, could drag out all in their path without covering every inch of the wood. It was a clever idea against the average enemy. A true Darkon could cross the forest without ever setting foot on the ground. She might still make a rustling noise, but the Sadie would never spot her against the treetops. Let them think a monstrous squirrel was about. Milan's foot found purchase on the knot of a pine tree before her, and she pushed herself up to reach the first branch with her left hand. Her weakened grip almost immediately gave way. A desperate grab of her right caught another limb, but her foot slipped free and kicked the bushes below. The scrape of sliding metal, the covers lifted from the Sadie's lanterns, and lights flared farther up the path to light the foot of the pine tree as she dangled by a single hand. The pine faithfully hid her in its shadow, as the Sadie backtracked toward the sound, their eyes trained to the ground. What they assumed was the only cover for their quarry. With a slow, steady breath, Milan willed herself to calm. She did not flinch as the Sadie beat at the bushes near the tree where she dangled. She barely breathed and remained as unfeeling and unmoved as stone. The young Sadie, who were perhaps not inclined to encounter a true Darkon in the night, soon tired of their fruitless search. Anyone they would be willing to confront in a black forest would be turned from their cover by the thrashing of the brush. They shuttered their lanterns and returned to their patrol. Not until they faded into silence did Milan move. Now, more aware of the limitations of her left hand, Milan took care to rely on her right. By starts and stops, Milan made her way to the grove in the southwest quarter of the crater before descending from the trees. The lack of ground cover made the grove seem a dangerously exposed area, but for the hollow that had once been a pond and tributary stream to the lake lower in the crater. Milan approached the hollow with a silent tread, watching the whole area for several minutes before drawing near. Balmor was not alone. Beside him stood his nephew Cillian, a kind soul with the body of a man nearing 30, and wits fixed forever as a pleasant but innocent 8-year-old. Whether Freer had foolishly hoped that Balmor would leave his nephew behind, or had simply neglected to tell Milan the worst in advance, she did not know. It didn't matter now. Cillian was here, and Milan was not about to send such an easy target back to Falson's clutches. With a low, trilling whistle that could pass for night noise to any not listening for it, Milan informed them of her presence. They signaled a greeting, saving speech for only what was necessary. Milan's eyes passed over each in a quick check of their readiness for the hike ahead, and they each confirmed with a nod. To avoid the risk of frightened realization later, Milan told them their path now, while at the safest point in their journey. She looked Cillian in the eye and stated, "We will be going through Ascari." Cillian's eyes rounded in fear, and Balmor asked, "Why?" "Even the Sadie will not bother to guard the dead," Milan replied. Reaching Ascari still meant an hour walk through the stretch of forest that certainly would be guarded, but there was nothing for that. Turning to the ditch that once was a stream, Milan led her charges into the woods. A weak knock, not willing to be heard, barely made it through Lord Falson's door. "Enter." Yarian entered with his hands clasped tight to prevent them from shaking. He stayed out of sight behind Falson, who sat at his desk. Yarian spoke. "My lord, Milan cannot be found. She is not in her hut." "It took you over an hour to tell me this, Yarian," Falson answered without looking up. The Darkon Master's brow furrowed. He was curious at how Falson knew this, and in the same instant repulsed by how close a watch Falson kept on the Darkons. "Fortunately, I have already taken action," Falson assured. "She and I will meet up later. You and I have different visits to pay now." As Dron Freer made his way toward his hut, he noticed a large bonfire in the center of the green, where a mix of Sadie and Darkons gathered. Dark figures hovered, constantly feeding the fire, and as Freer inhaled a sickening odor, he wondered what served as fuel. Surely they were burning some animal's remains in the morbid sacrifice to glory. The Sadie followed an archaic Gospel religion, in which elemental water and fire were sacred. Freer forgave them for their heritage, but was repulsed with his fellow Darkon's participation in this spectacle. Darkons had once abhorred ritual burning, because many of their own had perished in the fiery fields of the volcano Quincal and the Mountain of Blood. Death by fire or cremation was among the highest insults to Darkons. In disgust, Freer avoided the bonfire to take an arching path through the woods to avoid the green. Freer reached his hovel. Without thinking, he slid open the door to his hut, entered, then shut the door. For a moment he paused, leaning against the frame, lost in a moment of despair. The young Darkons around the bonfire served reminder that Freer was fighting a losing battle. But he drew himself up resolutely. He would not give up. Milan was free. He had done that much. And there was more to be done. Although he admitted to himself he did not know what. All he needed was to clear his mind with rest. Freer crossed the floor and drew back the curtain to his bedchamber to find Drana Yerian standing within. Drana Yerian, Freer said. As an afterthought, he had a traditional bow of respect. I'm sorry, Drana Freer, Yerian muttered slowly. To see you have plotted against us. What? Freer whispered. Yerian's head dropped lower, and he stepped out of the way to reveal, seated at Freer's desk, Lord Falsone with a wicked smile stretched across his face. In Falso's hand was a folded piece of parchment. Its red seal, which was Freer's, had been impatiently broken, and the front was addressed in Freer's clear script, to Senye Isaac. Freer managed to stop his gasp before. He knew well the contents of that letter. It contained not only his writings, but those of other masters, bearing words never intended for Falsone's eyes. I permitted you the freedom to communicate, because it has always been yours. I did not wish anything to appear abnormal. And this is what comes of my leniency, Falsone stated in a calm tone. You have been conversing with the Senye. Leniency, Freer repeated in anger. My brother is Senye. Why should I not speak to him? I thought you had more honor than to deny your guilt, Falsone remarked with his own hint of anger. You have more pride than to make futile pleas for mercy, I'm sure. Why should I have to plead for mercy? Freer demanded. Even if Freer refused to, Drana Yerian did not hesitate to plead. Freer, please, tell him the truth, that you've plotted against him. It's your only chance to live, Freer finished. Why should I have to explain myself to him? He is not my master. Oh, yes, I am. The Darkons are mine, Falsone said simply. Freer looked incredulously to Yerian, whose head dropped even lower in remorse. No person belongs to another, Freer stated in defiance. A quietly muttered plea escaped Yerian's lips. Please, confess. The others did not, and confess! So when is it a sin to speak to one's own brother? It is a far greater crime to enslave others, Freer cried in indignation. Nonetheless, you have plotted against your master. The worst crime imaginable, Falsone turned the Darkon code against Freer. You have communicated with an enemy of the Darkons, and helped fugitives to escape. For that you must be punished. At that moment, guards, both Lord Falsone's Sadie and Darkon, rushed in, surrounding Drana Freer with drawn swords. Falsone entered the circle around Freer, until his face was mere inches from his prey. Falsone asked, Did you wonder what that smell from the fire was? With his right hand, Falsone toyed with the medallion that Freer wore around his neck, then said, You see, rulers have enemies who must be destroyed. fires are quick and without prejudice. A little cruel, some may say, but don't worry. You'll suffocate from the smoke before the flames even reach you. Freer grabbed at Falcone, drawing the dagger at his belt. Like flies, the guards were upon him before he could make a scratch. Falcone laughed. The deceptive peace of the woods as they walked for 40 minutes, with only the gentle rustle of leaves, could have lulled any into a false sense of security, and Milan feared it might do precisely that for Sullivan. He was prone to singing to himself, in a surprisingly sweet tenor. That was a welcome sound on many occasions, but would not pass for inconspicuous night noise, but still signaled a periodic halt, purely to keep the danger alive in Sullivan's mind. She did not enjoy the look of fear in his eyes, but if it got them through alive, she believed the deception could be forgiven. One such pause came at a fortunate moment. Milan signaled a warning near the foot of a rise, just as a real Sadie watch reached the crest of the hill and stood silhouetted against the night sky. Had she been a few steps farther along, the angle of the rise and the thick trees would have blocked him from view until she was almost upon him. Only a Sadie watch, unfamiliar with the dark on night vision, would be fool enough to position himself so. Milan gestured for Balmor and Sullivan to hold their place. As she moved up the rise to intersect with the watch, she stationed herself behind a tree, waiting not only for the Sadie to walk into her trap, but also listening for sound of a parallel patrol, like those near the crater floor. Only one set of footfalls moved through the night. When the Sadie passed the tree she was behind, Milan allowed him a few paces until he moved into a small clearing, and then looped her right arm around his neck. Her forearm pressed against the artery, and her left arm crossed his chest to keep him from reaching a weapon. Still, there came the sound of a drawing blade. He had to be of true Darkon stock to have spotted her in the dense woods, and have remained so silent. A glint of moonlight off his blade showed that he held it raised as a threat, in an apparent moment of indecisiveness. It was an advantage Milan seized. Her injured left hand could not counter alone, so she resorted to her last alternative. Hope that this Darkon was not fully corrupt. Milan's left hand ripped the mask from her face, and she looked the young Darkon straight in the eye. He froze. Milan did not break the gaze, even as the Sadie in her grasp lost consciousness, and she lowered him slowly to the soft pine needle floor. Silently, Milan rose with her eyes alone challenging the young Darkon to be next. In absolute silence she stared down the boy, a young mind likely caught in the excitement of playing the hunter, and now for the first time confronted with the reality of his game. At last, he turned his sword over and drove it into the ground as he sank to his knees in a sign of submission. Milan signaled Balmor and Sullivan to follow, and they left the boy with bowed head. She did not fear he would raise an alarm. Only 3 more quickly scaled ridges stood between them and the cliff wall near Ascari. No vegetation grew in the scree here, and the compacted path through it from the crater floor was utterly exposed. Dark figures against the nearly white ash stone would stand out even for Sadie eyes to see, so Milan had chosen the route through the trees. Now, to reach the carved ladder over the cliff wall, they must cross a short section of the noisy, loose stone. Anxiety compelled them to move quickly out of sight, but as one stone might start the avalanche that brings down the mountain, one piece of tumbling scree, amplified 100 times by the cliff walls, would draw every Sadie. Crossing the broad field of stone gave an uninterrupted view of most of Haling. In the largest green near the center of the crater, a new bonfire blazed even larger than the rest. It sickened Milan to see her Darkon family consumed by the primitive Kaspel ritual, no longer practiced even among their own kind. At least their preoccupation with whatever ceremony and sacrifice the bonfire represented meant fewer eyes were turned toward the wasteland gate to Ascari. With painful slowness, they crossed the rubble in silence, and at last reached the packed ground at the foot of the ladder cut into the cliff wall. Shallow grooves cut the stone at intervals to form what Milan considered the world's most terrifying ladder. Though it rose only some 20 feet, there was nothing to break the fall or prevent a person from careening down the full face of the stone field. Milan gestured for Sullivan to help his uncle with a leg up, so that the first third of the way the old man would have some support. She would go last. If her left failed and she fell, the other two at least stood a chance if they were already over the edge. The guiding hand of his following nephew saw Balmor over the top, and soon Sullivan disappeared as well. Milan's right hand seized the stone rung of the ladder, and then she wedged her left forearm into the next carved shallow to slowly work her way up. The rock tore a new hole in her already thin sleeve and drew blood, but she persisted. At the top, Sullivan's smiling face waited with an extended hand that she gladly seized, and he pulled her up to the top of the crater. Ostathals, the memorials of those lost to age or battle, lie inside Haling. Ascari, a barren field of stone on the crater slope, was home to the restless dead. Plague had started the cemetery some uncounted centuries before, and since then, those taken unjustly and cruelly long before it should have been their time, were laid with the other Kari, the taken. Small mounds of stone, glowing stark silver in the waxing gibbous moon, peppered the side of the mountain, in memory of the tiny souls that were lost before they truly lived. Milan considered it fitting that these three should make their escape through Ascari, when each would have been condemned to it in a different age. Poor Sullivan might have been abandoned to the Darkons only too late when his condition became known, and both Balmor and Milan had committed the unforgivable sin of having the wrong parents. With the utmost caution and respect, they slowly weaved their way through the unnamed graves. Small personal items like a blanket or toy, tattered by wind and faded by sun, dotted the occasional marker of Kari, who had been outlived by some soul who still cared. The shriek, like a child in pain, froze all three, and Sullivan nearly screamed, if not for his uncle's protective hand. "Herald of death," Sullivan whispered. Milan could not blame Sullivan for his fear. Any sound could mean their doom, and legend told that to hear a child's cry from Ascari in the night was indeed a herald of death. Milan felt her own blood run cold. Without breath, they waited for any following sound, like the dread noise of a footstep on crumbled stone. "Calm, Sullivan," Balmor murmured. "It's only a mountain line, and far from here," Milan assured in a whisper. She reached a hand to Sullivan to help him down the path. "Come. You are safe." Though fear still lingered in his eyes, Balmor told Sullivan in good humor. Even death would not dare gainsay Milan. Milan wished it were so. Epon stood in the thicket as Freyr had promised, and greeted Milan with a both happy and reprimanding whinny. Milan saw Balmor and Sullivan onto the Lanark road, before taking her own path farther east. Before pre-dawn had made the sky pink on the second day, Milan reached the nearby town of Hambor, where she rested until the town gates were opened at dawn. Milan rode through the southern gate on the back of a wagon, having tied Epon up outside. The cart bumped up the narrow street that curved uphill to the west side of town. There was little room to maneuver between crowds of pedestrians walking down the steps on the left and the carts on the graveled right. A shopkeeper glared at Milan from his front booth, and every passer-by shot her looks from narrowed eyes. But none dared look long. Clothing of distinctive Darkon style gave Milan away, and many felt Darkons had no place in civilized society. But she felt the glances more numerous than usual. A man spat. It might have been in her direction. Darkons in Hambor were even further out of popularity these days. Halfway up the hill, Milan abandoned her ride to enter the curiosity shop. She pulled open the door and stepped into the indoor garden. A stream trickled by the entrance and ran through the store to fuel a small waterfall in the middle. On days of pleasant weather, like this morning, slats in the ceiling opened to let in natural light for the plants growing on the walls and rocky shelves. Interspersed with the decor was an immense variety of merchandise, from little bric-a-brac to huge ceremonial swords. Heirlooms, sold by indigent heirs. As if she did not notice any of the wonders around her, Milan crossed the bridge over the stream and walked to the barred counter that looked into the back room. A man with a large mustache that covered the bottom half of his face and glasses that covered the top half sat working. Observing her approach, the man got up from his desk to greet her. "Hello, Milan," he said from the open door of the back room. "So what business can I do for you today?" "Hello, Edwin," Milan replied. "Just a few things I recently got from the Seigneur." "Ah, those would fetch a high price. With the trouble of the missing scrolls, any Seigneur merchandise is selling fast. Let's see what you have." Milan followed him to the back office. A large candelabra on the table illuminated the room full of boxes and odds and ends, crowded into tightly packed, but organized, stacks. Milan untied the small sack that she carried on her back, reached inside, and emptied most of its contents onto the table. Amulets, a handful of signets, and even a small statuette. "How did you get these?" Edwin asked with a furrowed brow. These were not easily swiped daily items, but taken from personal shrines, if not the monk's person. "Midnight raid on the Seigneur Abbey." A mischievous smile raised the corner of Edwin's mouth. With a wink, he asked, "Did you happen to get anything a little more valuable, perhaps?" "If I had, I wouldn't tell you," Milan replied. Edwin smiled. "Is that all?" he asked as he quickly sorted the items into 3 groups. "Unfortunately so," Milan said. With a fake dramatic sigh, Edwin began scribbling the items in his catalog. "Sad to see this occupation forced on you, Milan. You were the best Dargon of your generation, and now you're depending on a pawn shop for money." Milan's eyes darkened. She was sick of hearing people ask, "Why aren't you what I want you to be?" "Maybe you all had too many expectations." "They expected what you were capable of," Edwin objected without looking up. Milan ignored his comment. "Well, I'm sick of a job that gets no respect because you don't have the honorable name of Seigneur. And they get all the credit hiding behind their unearned reputation. I'm sick of it, and I'm going back to Ocean." Edwin was silent through this. He knew how Milan felt toward the Seigneur. He had heard it as long as he had known her. She had every right to her opinion, and every reason to believe it. "That's why you need the money." "I see," Edwin said quietly. He replaced his quill in the inkwell, then left the room, followed by Milan, heading to the neighboring travel agency connected to the curiosity shop. Both businesses were owned and run by the same man, but they were conjoined mostly so wealthy customers of the agency could shop the oddities of the curiosity shop without being seen to enter a pawn shop from the street. The travel agency arranged escorts and helped map safe routes through wild territories. As a business that catered mainly to the wealthy, it had to be proper with whitewashed walls framed in dark wood molding. The agency was divided into 4 decorative sitting rooms, filled with cushioned chairs for the patrons to lounge. Silk tapestries adorned the walls, with pictures of distant travel destinations, and cabinets held a selection of fashionable drinks. Milan had always been amused by the opulence of the agency, when success in the business required familiarity with the most despicable of society. Like herself. Edwin went to the room farthest back, sat down at the desk, pulled a beaten gray strongbox from its drawer, and set it on the table. With a key he wore on a leather chain around his neck, he unlocked and flipped open the lid to reveal piles of silver. Azure counted out 30 squashed coins. "That's more than you owe me for the trash I dragged in," Milan told him. Edwin laughed as he put away the box and looked over his glasses. "That's why I like you. Always honest." "Go on, take it. We'll call it a favor to a friend," Edwin said, pushing the money toward her. He also pushed a paper over to Milan that she was to sign. She picked up the quill with her right hand, and with what was more of a scribble, signed the paper. Edwin mumbled. "What?" Milan asked, looking up. Nothing. Just thought you were left-handed. Caught off guard, Milan had not thought of an excuse for that. Hastily, she avoided the issue. If you live hand to mouth, it's good to be ambidextrous. Can you hold on to this? As Milan put the coins in her bag, she pulled out a thick packet of paper folded into an envelope and handed it to Edwin. He studied the addressee on the front with confusion. It's insane, huh? Edwin said. How do I know who it's for? The one that comes looking, Milan replied. Edwin raised an eyebrow and shook his head, but put the envelope in his jacket pocket. Before you go, let me make this offer. Milan crossed her arms. Now just hear me out, Edwin said. A noble's daughter is returning home from school in Lanark and needs an extra escort. Milan cut him off. I'm going back to Ocean. I'm not going to waste my time escorting some stuck-up brat. You'll be traveling anyway. You could just see that she makes it safely to Janta on your way to Ocean. Edwin, you know your geography better than that. They're in opposite directions. The Lord has offered double the standard fee. No, Milan said firmly. Even double the standard fee was hardly a substantial sum, because no one wanted to pay Darkons a respectable wage. So suspicion compelled her to ask, who would pay that much? His daughter is apparently an admirer of Darkon lore. You know noblemen's daughters get whatever they want. So he offers this. Edwin pulled from his desk a small wooden box with a pointed top, which I am to pay to you in advance. Curiosity drove Milan to pick it up and flick over the tiny clasp with her thumb. Edwin watched Milan closely, noticing that she didn't move her left hand. He saw the cloth that was wrapped around her left wrist and understood, but said nothing. She was surprised to see the box was filled with silver that totaled nearly half the standard fee, on top of the promised double pay. Janta, she repeated to herself. Edwin nodded. Now that he'd got her thinking about it, he would not push. Edwin waited patiently for Milan's answer. I'll do it, she said, snapping the box shut.